Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions. In today's episode, we'll explore labor policy and discuss the implications for environmental justice. I'm joined today by Jeff Johnson, former president of the Washington State Labor Council, AFL-CIO, and current board member of Labor Network for Sustainability. Welcome, Jeff, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on the show today, Jeff. We have known each other for so long. You and I have been through many campaigns, worked on many issues together, and I've always appreciated your personal commitment to environmental justice and all the work and time and thought that you've put into how environmental justice and worker justice can come together to really solve the climate crisis. So let's just start with the basics. If you can help our listeners, help us understand, in what ways are workers impacted by the climate crisis?
They're impacted the way everyone else is. We have so many workers that work outside for a living, whether it's farm workers or construction workers. And, increasingly as climate disrupts the weather, our folks are out there working in those situations. And so we're seeing greater amounts of injuries and illnesses on the job and a struggle to get employers to recognize that, extraordinary measures need to be taken to keep people safe, but not even that, just regular safety precautions. And, clearly the links between the pandemic and changing climate, we saw that as well with our frontline workers, whether they be grocery workers or nurses or paramedics or whatnot, really struggling to keep themselves and their families safe during these, really times of huge crisis and change.
And Jeff, when you and I worked together for quite some time in Washington State around climate policy, and I think in so many ways we were very aligned around our interests and the policy designs that we were proposing. And I think you and I recognized that the interest of environmental justice and the interest of worker justice were really aligned, and we could accomplish that through, I think, some shared policy and shared approaches. What is the common space between labor and environmental justice?
The essential values that the EJ community and labor community have are essentially the same. I mean, we want to have good jobs on a living planet. We want to make sure that our children and grandchildren thrive, that they have clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, that they can get good jobs. And so at the level of the individual, right, our interests are the same. We need to save this planet from catastrophe, and we need to, build back up our communities and have a stronger voice. I think where it goes a little awry at times is that oftentimes labor leaders are drawn in different directions and sometimes hold on to, kind of models from the past that's what the future looks like, and that if they say yes to, say, a Green New Deal type scenario, that it could put their members' jobs in jeopardy. It's very closed-minded thinking. And so I think what we need to do is create more opportunities for the EJ community and labor to come together to start just at the level of sharing values. What's most important in their lives, right? What's it going to take to create good jobs, safe housing, affordable housing, decent health care, to take care of each other, and then build from there and figure out how we create jobs together that are climate safe or that help us deal with climate disaster, or in the clean energy fields that, significantly lower carbon and allow us to build healthy communities. There's a shortage of construction workers right now. And when you think about it, oh my God, in this new energy economy, there's going to be a tremendous need for all the different crafts and skills within the construction industry. We're better to go than into those communities that have been most devastated by climate change, but had the least to do to cause it, to pair up and reach out and bring the EJ community into pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs, give them the skills to help them rebuild their own communities. Take one example, unfortunately, we have a set of construction unions that are just fixated on oil and natural gas pipelines. And, it's a death sentence for the world, but they look at those jobs because they're long-term and they provide really good wages. At the same time, we know that from the EJ community, whether you're in Jackson, Mississippi, or if you're in Michigan, that we have a serious water crisis and water pipeline crisis in our cities. I forget what the numbers are, but they're staggering, the amount of lead pipes that still feed our schools, our communities and cities. All of those pipes need to be replaced and brought up to modern standards and made healthy. And so thinking about pairing up the shortage of construction workers, we have no shortage of youth in the EJ community and the communities of color in our cities, pairing up the need for jobs with the need to create clean water systems within our cities, basically, jobs for the long term. So good jobs, healthy jobs, helping to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
I know you spent a lot of time in community talking to rank and file workers and other labor unions. I mean, do you feel that we are moving forward in this vision that you lay out? I mean, do you feel like the jobs versus environment dynamic still is very strong, or do you see some movement there?
I do see some movement there. And, so I'm going to give you a couple examples, within the teachers unions in Los Angeles and in Chicago, they're really leading in their bargaining with the school districts on bargaining for the common goods. So basically, whether it's teachers or janitors or food service workers or bus drivers, doesn't really matter. But as they bargain, they're looking to the community that they live in and that they teach in and thinking through what is it that we need for healthy children, so good houses, well heated, cooled, decent food supply chain, so on and so forth. And so they're bringing into their bargaining sessions, not just wages and benefits for janitors and teachers, but how they can make an impact on climate, how they can make their communities stronger, whether it's cooling stations or solar panels on businesses and apartment buildings. This is all entering into collective bargaining now, which is very, very interesting and exciting. The United Food and Commercial Workers, we know up in Seattle, Local 3000, they've created a climate caucus within their membership, which is incredibly exciting. And it's a prototype for other unions. And there's some other unions starting to do the same, where their members get educated about, what could they do in their industry that goes all the way from, the food supply, from growing it in the ground to selling it in the stores. How can we make a difference in terms of protecting our planet, as well as, making sure, kind of getting in control of the food sovereignty issue and clean food and organic foods. So this is an exciting time for those changes. So I am excited about that. I worry that we're not moving quickly enough. That's, I think, my dread. I think we've shared thoughts on this in the past. Sometimes I think that we've gone within 5 or 6 years, we've gone from not enough people, particularly in the United States, understanding climate change and climate disaster and understanding it enough to want to do something, to the point where now we see references to climate change and disaster all over the place. It's almost like we missed the point where people say, damn it, I'm angry and I want to do something. It's kind of, so I struggle with that, but I remain optimistic that both within the unions, particularly young members in unions and young members of color, pushing what they see, their lived experience, into union and labor policies and bringing the community into it.
So, Jeff, it's really exciting what you share in the possibility of unionized workers leveraging their power, both for wage and benefits, but broadly to benefit community and, by extension, addressing climate change. And I think what is so powerful between the environmental justice movement and the labor movement is this commitment to community organizing, this commitment to active conversation in the democratic process, and being able to bring forward that collective power for change. I think that's really what is so necessary in order for us to really address climate change and the disasters that are happening and ahead of us. What you laid out was really helpful for anyone listening who's a union member to think broadly about how they can use that position to address climate change. So what would you say to someone who's a worker or an environmental justice organization, what advice would you give them to build a relationship with their local unions or to have some of these tougher conversations about jobs versus the environment for those unions that are maybe, as you said, sort of stuck in the past in terms of how they think about this work?
First off, the more access we can create between the EJ community and labor, the better. We do need safe spaces. I think what we need to do is when we meet, when we talk, we need to, drop the myths that we may have about each other. Okay. And again, start with the simple value discussions. What is most important to you and your family and your community, and build it from there. We're, all kind of desperately concerned about, what the planet will look like for our grandkids and, will they be able to survive? But then when you get to the point of, how do we do action? How do we move on policy that is beneficial to us all? Building good jobs on a living planet. I think what we have to recognize, and far too often we don't, is that we really do have more power collectively than separately. And while unions typically have more financial resources than EJ groups and, have some resources that they can share, the EJ communities more often than not have their pulse on the wider communities, right? They come from the communities, they have a better sense of what the communities need, and together by joining forces, that makes it really, really difficult for those who've chosen to go into the political sphere. So politicians, legislators, city council people, so on and so forth, to move them more quickly into more comprehensive policies that are going to make our communities healthier and address climate. The more communities that come together, cross the divide and act collectively together, it's much harder to ignore us. And it's much harder to say, well, we worked on that last year and we really can't go much further. Enough of us saying, no, these are issues of immediate importance. And what we do now will pay tenfold in the years and decades to come. But if we don't act now, we're going to create problems that it's going to be almost impossible to dig out of. So it's that sense that one doesn't lose their individual identity if they come together as a collective, but they become stronger. And so unions have to recognize, and union leaders have to recognize that they shouldn't fear the community and fear that their members are going to say, we don't want to work with that group. Corporate America has used issues like that to divide us for centuries. And I think regular people, rank and file workers and rank and file community members, they get it, because they go to the same churches and synagogues and mosques. They go to the same stores, right? It's just they oftentimes don't see each other's as members of EJ organizations, members of unions. So anyway, it's drop the myths, drop the baggage, share your values, and recognize that collectively, none of us have all the solutions, and none of us has enough political power, but together we'll figure out the solutions, and we have greater political power to get the stuff done.
So let's talk a little bit about those solutions and kind of pivot a little bit more to specifics around policy design and approach. As I said, you've spent a lot of time out talking to workers across the country, deeply in Washington State, and had the chance to really bring forward very specific policy solutions that address some of the things that we've been talking about here. So can we talk a little bit about, those policy elements that you think are important to achieve that just transition?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was 2 weeks ago, I got the Washington State Labor Council to host a conference by the Just Transition Alliance, which is, as you know them well, they started, 25, 30 years ago, kind of an offshoot of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, but it was bringing the EJ community and labor together to really think through we're going to be losing jobs over time in this particular industry. And how do we how do people transit to, just and decent jobs? And it was beautiful to have the EJ and labor communities there together, talking through things. The issue of just transition is, I think for most of us, it's not rocket science, but it is scary. It's scary to the powers to be because it kind of changes the economic paradigm out there. It's basically saying, look, given this world that we live in that is so fraught with potential disaster, we've got to create jobs that are fair, that are equitable, that provide people with a decent wage, that provide them with healthcare, that provide them with pensions. We can't do it on the cheap anymore, right? We can't do it by exploiting workers. Creating a clean energy economy on minimum wage workers just recreates all the contradictions we have right now. And, so you have an enormous inequality, and I'm not sure you move fast enough or well enough to actually mitigate the climate crisis either. So, so we need to talk about clean energy jobs with prevailing wages, with, structured mentorship programs so that you're bringing youth into these jobs and you're giving them both a course of study as well as jobs to earn while they're studying, to become skilled craftspeople. You need to create a level of employment opportunity for those who historically have not had those opportunities. And that's critical. And it just so happens that now, given the shortage in the construction industry, there's not a more perfect time to do that than now. And, bringing community folks in, skilling them up, but also having them bring their lived experiences to unions and how they operate. Using the power of government financing to reward both good, safe, and equitable employment practices and safety practices, as well as, clean energy projects. We can do that if there's enough voice from community and labor to do that. Why wouldn't we want to solarize the city of Seattle? Right? Why wouldn't we want a series of community projects that create both employment and, and convert our energy even more to clean energy, supporting the production of panels? We have a manufacturer up in Bellingham can increase their production of panels and solarize large parts of Seattle, creating jobs for community members that are good union, decently paid, well benefited jobs, lots of things like that. We worked on a project. We got a city ordinance passed. It got slowed down because of the pandemic to do a deep dive energy retrofit in downtown Seattle. When it actually starts, it would create generational jobs for about 20, 25 years doing these deep dive energy retrofits, create a lot of jobs and lower the energy consumption in downtown Seattle. The estimates were between a third and 40%. I mean, that is huge. But it has to, it has to get going in Seattle, but it can be done in Tacoma, it can be done in Olympia, it can be done in Spokane, it can be done everywhere. It both helps us with the transition to clean energy, but also to, providing really well-paid jobs for folks in the community and breaks kind of the inequality that is, just an outgrowth of the way our market has operated historically.
I so appreciate, Jeff, the wide range of perspective that you brought on that policy overview. I think so much of the conversation, because of the jobs versus the environment political dynamic, it seems that so much of the jobs conversation is about fossil fuel workers and their interests and their retraining and their role in the economy. And there's so much more that we need to be thinking about and so many more people that can be included in the opportunity before us. You and I met, I think early on. I think one of the first things we really worked on together was around that moment when we were dismantling the welfare programs federally and in Washington state, and really thinking about how do we address this moment in which people were required to work, a lot of single moms with children who are required to work, and trying to figure out, how do we create the support that they need and the opportunities that they desire without it being such a punitive approach. And I think, it's an extension of that conversation that can live within the climate movement. I wanted to get your thoughts a little bit about just transition and the opportunity looking forward to move us to a cleaner economy, to clean energy sources. But there's also something that's growing more in the context of climate disasters. We saw in California incarcerated individuals used to fight fires. We understand immigrants and refugees are playing a role in cleaning up after climate disasters. I think it's always existed, right? There's some part of our society that it gets exploited as workers. They are working to protect us, to do work that we need. And we're seeing that grow more in the climate disaster space. And just wanted to see if you had any thoughts for people to think about or for us to consider as we see that I think you raised early on about workers in the fields who are exposed to smoke from the fires. So as the planet becomes more dangerous, any thoughts around what we should consider in that space?
This has been going on for quite some time in our own state. When we had a governor named Governor Gregoire, she allowed prison inmates to fight forest fires, and you create an outrage in our state. So California may have picked it up from what we did a while back. We stopped it. We stopped that practice, but it was reprehensible. After Katrina, immigrant labor was exploited like all get out to do the cleanup without proper safety equipment. So they were breathing, going into buildings and taking them down and breathing black mold and so on and so forth, not being paid, so on and so forth. So unfortunately, in capitalism, where there's an opportunity to exploit, there are exploiters that do that. But what I think is a real opportunity for us here is that as labor becomes more connected with the larger community, then the vision for both unions and what type of employment and what we should expect, what job characteristics we would expect in those jobs are going to broaden. These jobs are difficult, dirty, but should be respected jobs. They should be paid very well. They should be, the highest health and safety standards. And, it should be huge support from that in the community. It should be huge support within the labor community as well for that. And I'd love to see those workers represented. It's, still the more that workers can be represented, whether it's independently or within existing union structure, that matters less to me than the fact that when people come together, they're stronger. It does take financial resources, but also takes political power to make the types of changes and to see what happened in New Orleans and say that will never happen again. Not only will we not exploit immigrant labor to the point where they get sick and die to clean up this mess that we created, that humans created, but we're also not going to use them to tear down housing that particularly people of color fled during Katrina, and then there was nothing for them to come back to, and that was planned, that was part of the plan to rid the city of strong cultural communities. So we need to come together for so many reasons to break the cycle of inequality, to break the backbone of climate disaster and climate change, and also to change the economic paradigm and say, look, people need to be in control of their lives, which means they have to have a significant control over the work that they do, what it looks like, what it pays, and what their communities are going to look like. Because I trust much more the views and perspectives of people from the community of what they want to see than I do of some corporation saying what they want it to look like.
Jeff, we ask all of our guests a final question to lead us out with some hope. So what makes you hopeful about the climate justice movement today?
I guess what makes me hopeful is two things. One, just as I meet more and more folks in the EJ community and the tribal communities and communities of color working on these issues, they have deep values, they have passion, they have commitment, and they're fighting the good fight. And then young people. It took me a long time to figure out what was happening. I have so many people I have to thank, including yourself, for educating me on these issues. But young people today, more often than not, when I talk to them, these issues are foremost in their minds, and they want to do something, and they are doing something. And so I have hope that they will do a much better job than my generation did in solving these huge contradictions.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for being on the show today. I always enjoy talking with you. I appreciate our long partnership and the things that we've both learned from each other over decades of work together to try to make the world a better place.
Thank you, Aiko.
Thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Batista. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.